The autumn wind had painted the rolling hills of Woodstock, Vermont, in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Every morning, long before the sun managed to peek over the distant peaks of the Appalachian Trail, Arthur Valcarcel repeated the exact same quiet routine. The soft, rhythmic squeak of his wheelchair tires rolled across the wooden porch of the dairy farm, accompanied by the damp, earthy scent of freshly cut grass and the familiar warmth of the main barn. At 79 years of age, he knew every single acre of this land intimately, even though his legs could no longer carry him across the pastures he loved. Since the tragic passing of his beloved wife, Eleanor, the massive wooden farmhouse had completely ceased to feel like a proper home. The heavy clay teapot still sat untouched on the far corner of the kitchen stove, gathering a fine layer of dust. A hand-embroidered tablecloth remained neatly folded inside the very same dining room drawer, and the antique grandfather clock continued ticking away the long hours with cruel, unwavering precision. Absolutely nobody ever dared to move those precious objects from their designated resting places. Whenever Arthur wheeled himself past them, he instinctively slowed his pace, without even realizing it, as if his weary heart still expected to hear Eleanor's cheerful voice echoing from the hallway. That chilly morning, he forced himself to eat a meager breakfast consisting of black coffee and a piece of toasted bread drizzled with olive oil. He left more than half of the food completely untouched on his ceramic plate before heading slowly toward the main stable. Down by the pens, Charles Aranda was already meticulously inspecting the dairy herd with his usual quiet dedication. Just a few yards away, Charles's wife, Nancy, was busy preparing several large metal containers of fresh milk to transport to the bustling town market in the valley. Charles tipped his worn hat and greeted his old friend with a warm, respectful tone, wishing him a good morning. Arthur nodded tiredly, asking how the newly acquired young cow had handled her first rough night in the unfamiliar Vermont barn. Charles smiled kindly, assuring Arthur that the nervous animal was doing remarkably well and would likely join the rest of the herd by tomorrow morning. Arthur simply nodded again, absent-mindedly reaching out to stroke the warm, coarse back of a nearby resting cow. For many long years, these incredibly brief, polite exchanges were practically the only sounds that broke the suffocating, heavy silence of the sprawling agricultural property. Charles had known his employer long enough to understand exactly when to speak, and when it was better to just offer his quiet, comforting presence. When the morning inspection finally concluded, Arthur stayed behind for several minutes, silently gazing out at the vast, dew-covered meadows. He vividly remembered the countless long evening walks he used to take with Eleanor, back when they both passionately dreamed of filling this massive wooden house with laughing children and energetic grandchildren. However, the unpredictable current of life had mercilessly dragged them down an entirely different path. Relentless, back-breaking work had completely consumed every single season of the year, and by the time they finally decided to pause and enjoy the beautiful life they had built, their precious time had simply run out. Eleanor's devastating illness arrived without a single warning sign, and shortly after he tearfully buried her. A terrible fall off a ladder forced Arthur into a wheelchair permanently. Later that same afternoon, the sprawling Vermont sky began to darken, with thick, heavy storm clouds rolling in from the north. The biting wind strongly signaled an approaching rainstorm when a sudden, sharp knock echoed from the heavy oak front door. Unexpected visitors were so incredibly rare at the isolated farm that Arthur actually lifted his head, in genuine confusion and mild alarm. Charles quickly hurried over and opened the heavy door before the old man could even maneuver his wheelchair into the front hallway. Standing nervously on the wooden threshold were an exhausted older woman with a deeply lined face and a quiet young man of about 28 years of age. They wore incredibly clean but threadbare clothing that clearly showed the harsh wear of endless traveling, and their heavy boots were entirely coated in thick road dust. The weary woman gathered her courage and took a single, hesitant step forward into the warm light of the hallway. She softly introduced herself as Alice Cifuentes, gesturing to the silent, broad-shouldered young man beside her, identifying him as her devoted son, Gabriel. Arthur stared at the two unfamiliar strangers with a hardened expression, firmly refusing to utter a single welcoming word. Alice maintained her quiet composure, calmly stating that they had not come to the farm to beg for useless charity. She explained that they had walked through countless rural towns, desperately searching for an honest opportunity, asking only to earn their daily bread through relentless, hard labor. Gabriel remained perfectly silent, but his rough, deeply calloused hands, which were covered in countless tiny white scars, spoke volumes about his strong character. Arthur carefully studied those hardened, working fingers before shifting his intense gaze back to the desperate mother's tired eyes. He had spent years learning to deeply distrust wandering strangers, but the profound, unwavering dignity in Alice's gaze instantly reminded him of Eleanor standing up for what was right. He finally broke the silence, asking how many days they had been walking, and invited them inside for hot coffee. The following morning broke across the Vermont Valley, wrapped in a breathtakingly delicate mist that rolled down from the towering Pine Mountains. The incredibly comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and rich, dark coffee began to gracefully weave its way through the old farmhouse kitchen, though this time the surrounding silence felt remarkably less oppressive. Alice was already wide awake and working diligently when Nancy arrived carrying a heavy woven basket of fresh bread. She seamlessly began helping with the natural, unspoken grace of someone who deeply understands how to repay unexpected hospitality with genuine, humble service. She quickly sliced ripe red tomatoes, brewed the fresh coffee, and neatly arranged the simple breakfast spread on the long wooden table. When Arthur finally wheeled his chair into the sunlit kitchen, he was genuinely surprised to find the morning meal prepared with the exact same elegant simplicity he fondly remembered from decades past. Alice offered a very modest, polite smile, gently apologizing if she had taken far too many liberties in his private kitchen. She softly explained that she simply wanted to show her profound gratitude for everything the kind farmer was doing to help them survive the harsh season. Arthur quietly maneuvered his chair to the head of the table, took a slow, thoughtful sip of the steaming coffee, and bit into a crisp piece of toast. He sat in complete silence for several long seconds before sincerely complimenting the delicious meal, causing Alice to look down to hide her sudden tears. Meanwhile, out in the chilly morning air, Gabriel closely shadowed Charles as they walked together toward the massive dairy stables. The young man listened with intense, unbroken focus to every single detailed explanation regarding the specialized care of the livestock and the intricate daily operations of the farm. He had absolutely never worked in a professional agricultural setting quite like this one, but his curious mind never stopped asking incredibly sharp, relevant questions. Charles handed the young man a heavy metal bucket and wisely advised him that success on a farm does not belong to the fastest runner, but to the most patient observer. Gabriel nodded respectfully, deeply absorbing the older farmer's profound, hard-earned rural wisdom. Shortly after their conversation, while attempting to secure a heavy wooden gate, Gabriel accidentally left the metal latch improperly fastened. Without warning, two energetic young heifers immediately pushed the gate open and sprinted wildly out into the muddy central courtyard. Both men had to spend 20 exhausting minutes carefully and calmly jogging in wide circles to peacefully herd the frightened animals back into their proper enclosure. Gabriel leaned heavily against the wooden fence, breathing heavily, and immediately admitted to Charles that the entire stressful ordeal was completely his fault. Charles simply chuckled warmly, firmly securing the heavy latch himself, and assured the young man that a farmer's first day always provides more valuable lessons than an entire week of lectures. From the slightly dusty window of his private home office, Arthur had watched the entire chaotic scene unfold down in the courtyard without interfering. He was profoundly struck by the rare fact that the young man did not attempt to make a single cowardly excuse or shift the blame for his obvious mistake. Just a few minutes later, Arthur observed Gabriel returning to his heavy chores with the exact same meticulous care and focused dedication as before. Later that cool afternoon, Gabriel spent 3 hours helping Charles manually straighten and repair a rotting wooden fence line near the eastern pasture. Every single wooden plank they successfully hammered back into place seemed to magically restore a tiny piece of the old farm's fading structural pride. Inside the quiet farmhouse, Alice opened every single glass window to allow the crisp, sweet Vermont breeze to sweep through the dusty, forgotten corridors. She thoroughly polished the antique wooden furniture, scrubbed the kitchen counters, and meticulously reorganized the chaotic pantry shelves. Before finishing her exhausting afternoon chores, she quietly stepped out into the small, overgrown side garden where Eleanor had lovingly cultivated vibrant flowers for many long decades. Alice patiently knelt on the damp earth, gently plucking away the dead brown leaves, straightening several heavy terracotta pots that the harsh wind had knocked over, and watering the dry soil. When Arthur finally rolled his chair out onto the wooden porch, he found her respectfully leaning over the neglected rose bushes. Arthur stared at the garden for a long moment, his voice trembling slightly as he quietly mentioned that Eleanor used to love those specific flowers more than anything else. Alice gently brushed a delicate red petal with her fingertips before softly replying that it was incredibly obvious someone had truly loved them, and therefore they absolutely deserved to keep blooming. The elderly man did not offer a single word in response, choosing instead to sit perfectly still, watching a clear drop of water slide slowly down a vibrant green leaf. It had been an agonizingly long time since absolutely anyone had treated that sacred little corner of the property with such profound, touching reverence. As the cool evening darkness finally descended over the valley, Gabriel returned to the warm farmhouse, with his broad hands completely covered in fresh, painful scrapes. Nancy finished serving the hearty dinner, while Alice carried a large, steaming cast-iron pot of soup to the center of the wooden table. The evening was wonderfully filled with Charles telling thrilling stories about the legendary historic livestock fairs, while Gabriel eagerly asked endless questions about the history of the local town. The time slipped away effortlessly, and for the very first time in countless years, Arthur felt absolutely no depressing urge to retreat to his lonely bedroom early. Before finally going to sleep, Arthur wheeled himself down the dark hallway, stopped at Eleanor's permanently locked door, took a deep breath, and turned the heavy brass key. Nearly 10 full months passed seamlessly since the rainy afternoon when Alice and Gabriel first arrived at the Vermont farm. Step by slow step, the sprawling Valcarcel property miraculously recovered a vibrant, energetic rhythm that Arthur honestly believed was lost to him forever. The property was no longer dominated entirely by the howling mountain wind and the lonely, echoing moos of the dairy cattle. The spacious farmhouse was now constantly filled with lively conversations during hot meals, the rhythmic clanking of metal buckets at dawn, and the soft, joyful laughter that healed the painful silence. Gabriel continued absorbing every ounce of agricultural knowledge he possibly could by working closely alongside Charles every single day. Ever since his embarrassing first mistake with the escaping heifers, Gabriel had started carrying a small, worn leather notebook tucked inside his chest pocket. Every single afternoon, he would carefully sit down and write out detailed feeding schedules, complex veterinary notes, and anything else he deemed absolutely critical to the farm's survival. Although he occasionally still made very minor errors, every changing season required far less guidance from Charles than the season before it. One exceptionally bright morning, while the two men were organizing the dusty back storage room, Charles pried open a heavy, forgotten wooden cabinet. He carefully pulled out a tall stack of incredibly old, leather-bound notebooks that were completely covered in a thick layer of gray dust. Charles smiled nostalgically, explaining to the young man that these precious books contained the handwritten legacy of Arthur and Eleanor. He proudly stated that the entire beautiful history of the sprawling farm was meticulously recorded within those fragile, yellowed pages. Gabriel wiped his dirty hands on his jeans and gently turned the delicate pages, studying the ancient financial accounts and hand-drawn maps of the property. Tucked away between two random pages, he discovered a beautiful, faded ink sentence stating that, as long as they worked the land together, their home would never feel empty. Gabriel smiled softly, carefully closed the heavy ledger, and respectfully placed it back in its exact original position on the wooden shelf. Later, that exact same afternoon, Arthur formally requested Gabriel's presence inside his private, wood-paneled office at the front of the house. The elderly man leaned back in his leather chair, mentioning that Charles firmly believed Gabriel now understood the farm better than most men who had lived there their entire lives. Gabriel instantly shook his head with profound humility, softly insisting that he still had a massive amount of important things left to learn. Arthur let a warm, genuine smile cross his wrinkled face, noting that his beloved Eleanor used to repeat that exact same humble phrase every single harvest season. For over an hour, Arthur sat and shared incredible, detailed stories about the brutal early winters they survived, and the beautiful family they never got to have. While the old man spoke, his trembling fingers absent-mindedly stroked the worn, polished edge of his antique oak desk. Gabriel sat perfectly still, actively listening to every single word without ever daring to interrupt the sacred flow of the elderly man's precious memories. In that quiet room, the young man finally comprehended that this vast property was not merely a business, but the physical embodiment of an entire lifetime of shared, unconditional love. Meanwhile, out in the main living areas, Alice continued managing the household chores with the exact same delicate, respectful touch as always. She absolutely never moved or cleaned a single one of Eleanor's personal keepsakes without first explicitly asking for Arthur's direct permission. One quiet Tuesday, Alice discovered a dusty woven basket, overflowing with brightly colored balls of yarn, and an unfinished, deeply faded knitting project. She carefully washed the dust away, organized the tangled yarn, and respectfully placed the basket back onto the exact same wooden rocking chair where Eleanor used to spend her evenings. When Arthur eventually rolled his chair through the living room, he stopped abruptly, staring at the beautifully restored memory corner. He reached out and gently brushed the smooth wood of the rocking chair with his fingertips, before turning to look at Alice. She smiled gently, softly whispering that she simply thought the beautiful basket belonged exactly where it had always been. Arthur did not utter a single word in response, but he offered her a slow, profoundly grateful nod of his head. Later that same week, as the family gathered around the warm dinner table, Charles casually broke a crusty piece of bread in half. He smiled warmly at the group, happily declaring that the large wooden house finally sounded like a real home again after so many years of agonizing grief. Nancy beamed with joy as she noticed Arthur was still comfortably sitting at the head of the table, even though his coffee cup had been completely empty for 20 minutes. It had been nearly an entire year since the elderly man had voluntarily stayed at the dinner table just to enjoy their company. However, the beautiful, hard-earned peace of the farm was abruptly shattered one unexpectedly cold Tuesday morning. A sleek, incredibly expensive dark automobile crunched loudly up the long gravel driveway and parked directly in front of the main porch. An elegantly dressed man, with perfectly styled hair, confidently stepped out of the luxury vehicle, pausing for several seconds to critically evaluate the sprawling pastures. Charles frowned deeply from the barn, quietly noting to Gabriel that this particular man had not visited the rural property in over 10 years. He explained that the visitor used to spend his childhood summers at the farm, learning how to ride horses under Arthur's patient, loving guidance. Arthur wheeled himself out onto the porch, his face tightening as he quietly muttered the name of his estranged great-nephew, Richard. The younger man confidently marched up the wooden steps, flashing an impeccably rehearsed, utterly hollow smile at the elderly farmer. Richard loudly proclaimed that it was finally time for him to come visit his favorite uncle, offering incredibly stiff, superficial greetings to Alice and Gabriel. Despite his polite words, Richard's sharp, calculating eyes continuously scanned the massive stable, the heavy farming equipment, and every valuable corner of the property like an impatient buyer. During the tense afternoon lunch, Richard aggressively interrogated his uncle regarding the daily milk production, the exact acreage of the land, and the overall financial expenses. He barely bothered to ask a single genuine question regarding Arthur's declining health or his daily struggles in the wheelchair. Before finally deciding to leave, Richard casually strolled out to the barn and discreetly cornered Charles near the tractor shed. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward Gabriel, suspiciously noting that the young stranger seemed to be learning the family business far too quickly for his liking. He bluntly demanded to know exactly how much longer the wandering strangers planned on squatting on his family's valuable Vermont property. Charles crossed his arms defensively and responded with absolute, unwavering serenity, declaring that as long as Gabriel cared for the dirt, the farm's doors would remain wide open to him. Richard visibly tightened his jaw, utterly refusing to offer a verbal response to the loyal farm manager's bold defense. Instead, he coldly watched from a distance, as Gabriel gently and respectfully helped Arthur adjust his frail body into a more comfortable position in his wheelchair. As Richard finally sped his luxury car back down the dusty gravel road, a dark, jealous realization washed over him. He realized that the wealthy agricultural throne he had arrogantly assumed was rightfully his was rapidly being earned by a complete, hard-working stranger. That night, a heavy, uncomfortable tension hung thick in the air, and nobody spoke a word during the evening meal. Long after everyone else had gone to sleep, Arthur remained sitting silently by his bedroom window, watching a fierce storm roll in. The freezing rain battered aggressively against the fragile glass panes as he stared out into the pitch-black void covering his beloved pastures. He spent hours agonizing over the complicated legacy of his life, deeply weighing the heavy burdens of bloodlines against the undeniable proof of true loyalty. He finally reached a profound, unshakable conclusion in his heart, reaching up to switch off the small bedside lamp without a single ounce of hesitation. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he planned to visit the town lawyer, Andrew Urrutia, the very next morning. The following morning, Arthur requested that Charles help him load his heavy wheelchair into the old farm truck much earlier than usual. The gloomy Vermont sky remained completely blanketed by a thick, freezing layer of gray clouds, fiercely promising another bitterly cold day in the valley. Before Charles started the roaring engine, Arthur paused, gazing through the truck window at the beautiful, synchronized activity happening across his property. He watched Gabriel expertly handling the morning cattle run, while Alice and Nancy cheerfully prepared the warm farmhouse for another productive day. Without him ever planning it, this beautiful, unexpected harmony had somehow blossomed into the absolute center of his remaining life. The private legal office of Andrew Urrutia was located inside a beautiful, historic stone building, directly across from the busy town hall plaza. The seasoned attorney warmly welcomed Arthur into his warm, wood-paneled office with a remarkably firm, respectful handshake. Andrew smiled warmly, pouring 2 cups of hot tea, and softly mentioned that it had been a very long time since the farmer had visited town. Arthur firmly gripped the wooden armrests of his wheelchair, stating clearly that he needed to be absolutely certain before making this monumental journey. For several long minutes, a comfortable, contemplative silence filled the warm office as the 2 old friends drank their tea. Finally, Arthur leaned forward, resting both of his frail hands heavily on his walking cane, and looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. He explained that for his entire life, he genuinely believed his massive acres of land were his only true, meaningful legacy. He continued, stating that he now possessed the wisdom to understand that a house only remains alive when the people inside it care for it with their entire hearts. Andrew remained perfectly silent, respectfully allowing the elderly man to speak his difficult, emotional truth without any interruption. Arthur painfully recalled how he and Eleanor had desperately waited their entire lives for a loving family to inherit and continue their exhausting, lifelong effort. The lawyer breathed softly, gently asking his oldest client if he was absolutely, completely certain he wanted to make such a drastic, irreversible change. Arthur slowly shook his head, confidently declaring that, on the contrary, every passing day made his decision feel more undeniably perfect. He officially commanded the lawyer to immediately draft a brand new testament that would permanently guarantee the total continuity of the Valcarcel dairy farm. The new document was to completely transfer the absolute ownership and total administration of the entire estate directly into the hands of Alice and Gabriel. Arthur firmly emphasized that this immense gift was not because they shared his family name, but because they had flawlessly proven their unconditional love for the land. When Arthur finally returned to the farm later that afternoon, he found Gabriel intensely focused on repairing a massive, broken wooden door on the eastern stable. After perfectly adjusting the heavy iron hinges, the young man repeatedly opened and closed the massive door to guarantee it swung with absolute, silent perfection. Charles walked by carrying a heavy sack of grain, warmly joking that the young man barely even needed his supervision anymore. Gabriel immediately stopped working, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and humbly denied the compliment, insisting he still learned crucial new lessons every single day. Arthur quietly observed the beautiful scene from the driveway, his heart swelling with immense pride as he watched the boy work exactly like he and Eleanor used to. Inside the warm, fragrant kitchen, Alice and Nancy were happily finishing the preparation of a massive pot of beef stew. They were laughing warmly together, excitedly discussing the upcoming weekend farmers market and planning which homemade cheeses they would display. The rich, savory aroma of the bubbling stew completely merged with the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. The open kitchen windows allowed the crisp, clean Vermont air to constantly refresh the room, making the entire farmhouse feel vibrant and alive. However, that very same evening, the peaceful atmosphere was violently shattered when Richard aggressively returned to the farm completely unannounced. Richard pushed his way inside with fake, exaggerated politeness, spending far more time aggressively inspecting the interior of the home than actually greeting the people sitting at the table. He sarcastically commented that Gabriel seemed to know every single hidden corner of the wealthy property incredibly well for a simple farmhand. Arthur sharply defended the young man, loudly declaring that Gabriel had worked incredibly hard to earn every bit of his extensive knowledge. Richard let out a cruel, brief laugh, muttering that he always assumed he would be the one inheriting and learning the secrets of the valuable family estate. For several agonizing seconds, an absolutely suffocating silence brutally choked the warm air inside the family dining room. Richard then began loudly asking incredibly invasive questions regarding the farm's legal future, claiming that neighboring farmers were actively gossiping about who would eventually control the immense wealth. Recognizing the incredibly dangerous direction of the conversation, Gabriel quickly excused himself and walked out into the freezing night to help Charles, desperately wanting to avoid a physical confrontation. When Richard finally left the property, Alice slowly began clearing the empty ceramic plates with trembling hands. She quietly apologized to Arthur, expressing deep regret if their presence was destroying his family relationships. Arthur looked up with absolute clarity, firmly stating that a true family is never the people who only remember you when they smell an inheritance. Exactly 2 days later, the attorney officially confirmed over the telephone that all the complex legal documentation was perfectly prepared. He assured Arthur that the massive legal transfer only required his final, binding signature to become completely permanent. That night, the elderly farmer wheeled himself quietly into Eleanor's pristine, untouched bedroom and slowly approached her beautiful wooden portrait. He gently ran his wrinkled fingers along the smooth, polished frame, spending several emotional minutes just staring into her painted, joyful eyes. He softly whispered into the dark room that, after all this painful time, he had finally found the perfect way to protect the beautiful dream they built together. He clicked off the bedside lamp with an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute tranquility washing over his tired soul. He absolutely no longer felt the terrifying dread that he was foolishly abandoning his precious past to greedy, uncaring hands. He knew with absolute certainty that he was permanently securing a bright, honorable future for the Valcarcel farm, honoring their lifetime of sweat. The early days of December arrived in the valley, bringing a brutally intense, freezing cold, although the relentless daily routine of the dairy farm remained completely uninterrupted. However, the joyful, warm atmosphere inside the main house had undeniably shifted since Richard's terribly toxic visit. Alice practically stopped speaking during the evening meals, choosing instead to stare quietly at her food with a deeply troubled expression. Gabriel intentionally started spending the vast majority of his waking hours working outside, in the freezing weather alongside Charles, purposefully keeping a massive distance from the main house. One freezing afternoon, while violently hammering frozen nails into a broken pasture fence, Gabriel suddenly dropped his heavy tool into the deep snow. He turned to his freezing mother and softly declared that the time had finally come for them to pack their few belongings and leave the property forever. Alice slowly looked up, her breath pluming in the freezing air, and asked him if he was completely sure about giving up the only real home they had. Gabriel fiercely explained that Arthur had generously opened his door to them when absolutely nobody else in the world cared if they starved. He firmly stated that he absolutely refused to allow the kind old man to suffer through a vicious, agonizing family war simply because they were there. Alice remained perfectly silent, heartbroken because she had grown to love the beautiful farmhouse just as fiercely as her son did, but she fully respected his honorable reasoning. That evening, she prepared the family dinner with the exact same meticulous, loving care she had shown since her very first day. Nobody dared to mention the incredibly heavy tension, though Arthur easily noticed that Gabriel barely managed to swallow a single bite of his warm food. When they finally finished clearing the wooden table, the young man slowly walked over and stood directly in front of Arthur's wheelchair. He took a shaky breath and formally announced that he and his mother would permanently depart from the farm at dawn the next morning. The devastating words seemed to instantly freeze in the warm air of the dining room, completely paralyzing everyone who heard them. Gabriel emotionally swore that Arthur's incredible kindness had forever saved their lives, and therefore they absolutely refused to cause him any more pain. Alice lowered her head, quietly crying as she promised they would always remember the beautiful wooden house with eternal, overwhelming gratitude. Arthur remained perfectly still, refusing to show a single ounce of panic or sadness for several excruciatingly long moments. Instead of accepting their resignation, he turned to Charles and firmly commanded him to immediately telephone Andrew Urrutia, the lawyer. He also strictly ordered Charles to contact his greedy nephew, Richard, demanding his immediate presence for the formal reading of his last will. The following morning, every single person gathered nervously inside the massive, antique dining room, as a brutal snowstorm raged outside the windows. A thick, heavy leather folder rested ominously in the absolute center of the large wooden dining table. Richard sat down in a plush chair with incredibly arrogant confidence, utterly convinced he was finally about to inherit his massive fortune. The lawyer slowly unclasped the leather folder, clearing his throat to announce that Arthur desired everyone to clearly understand his absolute, final wishes. The formal reading commenced, clearly stating that the property would permanently retain its historic name, but absolute ownership would immediately transfer to Alice and Gabriel. For 10 agonizing seconds, absolutely nobody in the quiet room dared to breathe or react to the shocking legal revelation. Suddenly, Richard violently shoved his chair backward, screaming furiously that the decision was illegal because he was the only true family bloodline. Arthur met his nephew's furious gaze without raising his voice a single decibel, holding his ground with terrifying calmness. He firmly stated that a true family does not always magically appear just because people happen to share the exact same last name. Richard tried to scream another insult, but the elderly man forcefully cut him off, his voice echoing loudly off the wooden walls. He reminded Richard that when he was grieving and broken, the young man absolutely never found the time to visit. while these strangers dedicated their entire lives to healing him. Richard stood perfectly frozen, his angry eyes darting around the room, finally realizing he had lost the massive farm many years ago due to his own selfish neglect. Alice covered her trembling mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely down her face as she looked at the legal document. She sobbed openly, desperately pleading with Arthur that they absolutely could not accept such an impossibly massive, life-changing gift. Gabriel aggressively shook his head, taking a step backward, swearing that manipulating the old man for money was never their intention. The elderly farmer offered them a brilliantly warm, overwhelmingly peaceful smile, reaching out his frail hands toward them. He softly declared that their pure, selfless hesitation was the exact reason why they were the only people truly worthy of the farm. Alice completely broke down, unable to hold back her overwhelming waves of emotion, while Gabriel stood absolutely paralyzed, completely unable to find his voice. Arthur looked deeply into their eyes, his expression radiating the pure, unconditional love of a father looking at his own children. He proudly declared that while his bloodline merely gave him a legal surname, they had miraculously given him back a real home. Nancy discreetly wiped a happy tear from her cheek, while Charles purposefully turned his head toward the snowy window to hide his massive, emotional smile. The lawyer slowly and respectfully closed the heavy leather folder, sealing the permanent, unbreakable fate of the beautiful Vermont property. Absolutely nobody dared to utter another argumentative word, completely respecting the beautiful finality of the legal decision. Outside the thick glass windows, the brutal winter storm continued to rage fiercely. But inside the old house, the emotional atmosphere had completely transformed. It was absolutely no longer a silence born from fear or uncertainty, but rather a profound, magical peace born from months of shared love. The Valcarcel farm finally possessed a bright, beautiful future, completely worthy of the massive sacrifices Arthur and Eleanor had made. As the freezing winter slowly melted into a remarkably vibrant, colorful spring, the farm began to flourish incredibly well. The months continued advancing beautifully, and the massive property breathed incredibly easy, perfectly matching the peaceful rhythm of its glorious past. Every single morning, Arthur joyfully wheeled himself across the sunny porch, happily watching Gabriel confidently lead the morning chores alongside Charles. He smiled as he watched Alice throw open the heavy wooden windows, allowing the sweet, floral mountain air to rush through the hallways. Without anybody ever needing to force it, every single person had naturally found their perfect, permanent place within the massive family. Gabriel organized the complex daily operations with remarkable veteran confidence, while Charles now only stepped in occasionally to offer wise, fatherly advice. Alice continued loving the beautiful house with the exact same humble, quiet discretion she showed on her incredibly desperate first day. She absolutely never attempted to erase Eleanor's memory, always making sure fresh, beautiful wildflowers perfectly framed the old woman's painted portrait. One absolutely perfect spring afternoon, while the entire group sat watching a breathtaking orange sunset from the porch, Arthur gently broke the comfortable silence. He looked at Alice and Gabriel, softly asking them if they knew what his absolute darkest fear was after Eleanor passed away. They turned toward him, remaining perfectly silent, giving the old man the respectful space he needed to share his deepest, most vulnerable truth. He confessed that he was absolutely terrified that every single beautiful thing he and his wife had built would simply turn to dust. Gabriel looked out over the massive, glowing green pastures before offering a profoundly beautiful, comforting response to his adoptive father. He softly promised that as long as the wooden farmhouse stood strong, a massive piece of Arthur and Eleanor would live forever. Arthur did not say another word, but his tired eyes remained locked on the beautiful horizon as a perfectly peaceful smile illuminated his face. As the beautiful seasons passed, the elderly man's physical strength began fading rapidly, but the painful ghost of loneliness absolutely never returned. As the farmhouse became filled with laughter, family, and honest work, Arthur spent his final morning watching Gabriel and Alice by his side, thanking them for bringing life back into his heart. Alice reminded him that it was his compassion that had first rescued them, and with the warm sun on his face, Arthur peacefully passed away, after asking them to always protect both the land and one another. His funeral drew a large crowd of grateful townspeople who remembered him as a man whose final years were filled with happiness and love. After the ceremony, Gabriel gathered the farm workers and promised that Arthur and Eleanor's values, traditions, and spirit would always remain at the heart of the farm. United by respect and loyalty, everyone embraced his promise, and in the years that followed, the Vermont dairy farm continued to prosper, while faithfully preserving its humble soul and enduring legacy. Years later, Gabriel modernized the farm, while faithfully preserving Arthur's values. Arthur's portrait stood beside Eleanor's in the farmhouse, and every autumn the family honored them together at their graves. One crisp morning, two exhausted strangers arrived at the farm, asking for work. Remembering the day he and his mother had once stood on the same porch in desperate need, Gabriel welcomed them inside for hot coffee, before discussing employment. Watching from the kitchen, Alice realized that Arthur's greatest legacy was never his land or wealth, but his courage to open his door to those who needed compassion. The Valcarcel farm continued to prove that a true family is built not by blood, but by kindness and unwavering love. The story reminds us that opening a door to someone in their darkest moment transforms not only the person receiving help, but also the one who offers it. Family is created through respect, loyalty, and the choice to stand beside others when they are alone. Wealth and social status eventually fade, but compassion, generosity, and sincere love leave a lasting legacy that survives long after we are gone. Every act of kindness can restore hope, heal old wounds, and give someone a place to belong, just as a single lantern shining through a storm can guide a lost traveler home. By treating others with dignity and building homes filled with grace, we keep the spirit of those we loved alive and create a future where no one has to face life alone.